In this video, we're going to take a look at Noodler's Kuprin. Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion. After a less than favorable Noodler's review, the last video, I decided to hit them up again. And we got better results, without a doubt. Not aggressive at all, and it's easy to clean. So let's look at this ink. It's very nice in tone. Look at that purple. Though for some reason, I kind of expected it to be a bit darker. Don't know why, but I did. It's still very nice. There is a little bit of tone variation that you'll see by Nib. Only extreme tone variation with an extreme difference in nibs. Now with that, you're going to have to pay attention to this versus some of the writing samples because I am using two very similar pens today. It shades very nicely and it does it really consistently. This is absolutely been a redeeming ink for me to use from Noodler's. And again, people like to pick on them, but I generally like them as a brand because there hasn't been very many that I've said, no, I don't want to touch this. This one, absolutely, this is beautiful to look at. It's just wait for those writing samples. It's going to be so nice. I like to change things up by using a different pen each day. Today that pen is a Parker Jotter with a medium nib. It's inked up, used for a day, and used to take the notes for this video. To see how I arrived at that opinion, let's take a look at the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine. Looking at the standard Noodler's nib, you see a beautiful purple tone that's not feathering. It's not spreading. It is shading rather nicely and fairly consistently, giving us dark letters in just about every word, making that constant transition from lighter to darker the whole way through. This is the shading that I love seeing in inks, and it always makes me happy to see it. Looking at the gold nib, it's the same tone that we had with the standard. It's not feathering. It's not spreading. It is shading, and I think it's shading a bit better than it did with the standard nib. And I can't say exactly why, but I put these pens together more to see the difference between what the gold and steel nib would do if it made that big of a difference. It was, let's run a year of that kind of experiment. This is beautiful. Sorry for the tangent. Looking at the Fude nib, it is a little bit darker, kind of, in that you see more of the dark tone, but it's still running all the same tones that we had with the last two nibs. It's not feathering, it's not spreading, it's shading beautifully without any kind of an issue. This entire way, I wish I wrote with this Fude nib much better. It just seems like there's only the one that I write well with. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding, no ghosting, no problem writing back here. To have a range of experience with this ink, all of the writing samples are done with a Noodler's AHAB with an extra fine nib. A Noodler's AHAB with a medium nib. A Noodler's AHAB with a 1.1 stub nib. The next writing sample is done in a FieldNotes Steno notebook. Looking at the standard Noodler's nib, it is a little bit lighter on this paper than we had on the Clairfontaine. We still get no feathering. We still get no spread. We still do get some shading, though not as standout as it was on the Clairfontaine, but this paper is quite a bit more absorbent. Regardless of how absorbent it is, we definitely see it happening. You can see it in the top line on the T of not. You see it on the dot of the I of trail. You see it in the H of each on the second line. It shows up constantly. Looking at the gold nib, we get about the same tone that we had with the standard. We get no feather. We get no spread. We get about the same shading that we had with the last one, where we, for the most part, have one tone, and every word does get to have one or two darker letters in it. So it's coming across very nicely. A little bit of character to the writing, especially when you write about math, which most people think are boring. Looking at the Fude nib, it's quite a bit lighter than we had with the last paper, but still in line with the tone we've seen on this paper. The same tone on this paper from the Fude as the others. Now, we are getting a little bit of feathering that occurs. It's incredibly tiny and not worth picking on. We don't get any spread. We get very little shading. This is the least shading that we get. And I think it's got something to do with maybe it's working kind of like a stub there. Looking at the back of the page, we do see that with the Fude nib, it came through a little bit, but it never touched the page underneath. You could certainly write on the back of the page with either of the other nibs because they have no ghosting. I agree with Vita. There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The next writing sample is done in an AmPad Steno notebook. Looking at the standard nib, the most noticeable thing is the tone is much more magenta leaning now from the tone of the paper. Now, with that, it's got the tiniest bit of feathers that occur. Nothing distracting to stop you from really using it. It's got no spread. It does shade, though not as well. Again, the tone of the paper is kind of absorbing that visually away from you. But look at Greco-Latin on the top, and you see a difference as it starts. It gets lighter in the middle, and then it works its way darker again. So it certainly is there. Looking at the gold nib, we get the same tone as the standard. It has almost no feathering. I say almost. There's a couple tiny spots. Not a big deal. We get no spread, which is always good. We get only the littlest bit of shading. The paper is just as it was with the last one, absorbing most of it. However, just look at that top line. Problem: starts darker, gets lighter, and gets darker again. In is darker, but Euler starts lighter and gets darker. So it certainly is there. Looking at the Fude nib, it looks a tad bit lighter than the other two. It does feather more noticeably. I don't really want to say that it spreads because I always have trouble judging that when I'm using this pen. It shades some, kind of, almost not at all, but the shading wasn't as nice on the last paper with the Fude, so I'm just feeling like it's not going to come through with shading a whole lot for the Fude nib. Looking at the back of the page, nothing bled through and touched the page underneath, but it does get quite deep into the paper. There's a lot of ghosting. Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. This smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. And here we see the results of the resistance test. The next writing sample is done in a national Steno notebook. Looking at the standard nib, we get that same magenta-ish tone because of the tone of the paper, so sorry to Noodlers for the paper that came up here. It's not showing the purple as well as it could. Now with that, we're not getting any feathering, we're not getting any spread, we're only getting great performance. We are getting some shading. Not a ton, nowhere like on the Clairfontaine, but I think when it stands out here, it stands out a little bit better than it did on the last paper. Looking at the gold nib, we get the same tone as the standard. We get no feather, we get no spread, we get some shading. Can we get a "this is a great ink" down in the comments, because this ink is absolutely redeeming Noodlers from the last one that I just didn't like it. I gotta forget it and move on. It's hard to forget. We're still looking at math, and anyone that thought that was boring was wrong. It's exciting. Looking at the stub nib, we get about the same tone as the other two. We get no feather. We get no spread. We get really better shading here than we've had with the Fude on the other papers. So doing fairly well and pretty happy with it. I do wish for a bit more of a purple than the magenta, but it is coming back towards the purple here. Looking at the back of the page, you see that we get no bleeding that came through and touched the page underneath because there's almost no ghosting. This is doing fantastic. With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables. Here is Ackerman number 15. Here is Diamine Imperial Purple. Here is Monteverde Amethyst. Here is Roher & Klinger Cassia. The next writing sample is done in an Office Depot Steno notebook. Looking at the standard nib, we get more of the purple coming back, which is nice. The tones of the paper is not affecting it as much. All that tends to mean is how translucent or opaque an individual ink is. This one would seem to be a little more opaque because it's affected a bit more by the tones of the paper. We get no spread, we get no feather, we do get shading, and the shading's coming through fairly well. Again, as always, not as well as on the Clairfontaine. Looking at the gold nib, we get the same tone as the standard. We get no feather. We get no spread. We get shading. Look at it in the top line, how dark it is. Took goes darker to darker, almost lighter to darker. 2 is a nice lighter tone, but Centuries gets dark again. It works its way darker. This is a very nice purple, and I don't know why people haven't been talking about this, or why they don't talk about math. Can you tell I like math? Looking at the Fude nib, it is just a tad bit lighter than we saw with the others. We get no feather, we get no spread, we get shading a lot here. I want to say we get shading kind of like we were seeing it more with the Clairfontaine, where it's much lighter to much darker and a lot frequently. Beautiful job. And it still holds on to that. It's a purple, it's not a magenta. Looking at the back of the page, you see there is no bleed through that touched the page underneath because there's almost no ghosting. Absolutely terrific in its performance. While it's nice to compare it to other inks in the same color family, I'd prefer to find an ink that complements its color on the page. Here is a green ink by Diamine, their 150th anniversary Dark Forest. Here is a gray ink by Geherbon, their Green Nuage. Here is a pink ink by Pilot, their Iroshizuku Kosumosu, or Cosmos. Here is a yellow ink by Krishna, their Danu Udak. The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper. Looking at the standard nib, definitely a purple, not a magenta. No feather, no spread. It is amazing in what it's doing. Absolutely. It is even shading some, which does have me scared on this paper, because shading on this paper usually means bleeding 19 pages down. We haven't had a bleeding problem yet. Looking at the gold nib, we get the same tone as the standard. We get no feather. We get no spread. We do get some shading going on. Is this a great ink for inexpensive or non-fountain pen paper? Yes, it is. Just look at how well it's doing. I really am putting this on my list for when time comes that I look for a new bottle of purple. I might be looking at this one. Looking at the Fude nib, it's a little lighter than we had with the other nibs in tone. We get the tiniest bit of feathering that does occur in some areas, but this is copy paper, and only tiny feathers, that is a miracle. Again, I can't say for spread, it's a Fude. We do see some spots of shading, which are warning signs that we may bleed like crazy, and we're holding on to hope that the back of the page looks really good. Place your bets. Looking at the back of the page, nothing bled through and touched the page underneath. It is a miracle. I really was expecting it. See, the back of the page, you get a lot of ghosting. You can't write back there, but man, this ink is good for non-fountain pen paper. So what nib and pen do I think is going to give the best writing experience with this ink? This is a fairly consistent color and performance. I mean, yeah, the Fude did quite a bit different things, but that's a very different kind of nib. The performance, outstanding. This is a dealer's choice. If you like this color, you can be happy with any pen that you put it into. So you should enjoy this. I definitely did. I hope you got something out of this video, and if you want to support the channel, you can over on Patreon. Thanks for watching.